Hello and welcome to the NPTEL course The History of English Language and Literature. Today's lecture titled Novel in the Age of Romanticism takes a look at the genre of novel which continued to develop in the age of Romanticism. Having taken a look at the rise of the novel in the 18th century, it is only imperative to ensure continuity that we look at the novel in the Romantic age, though the novel form was not a dominant or a representative genre. And also we noted multiple times that the age of Romanticism was dominated by the genre of poetry. But in order to see how the novel continued to develop and continue to evolve in the Romantic period, we need to take a look at the pre-Romantic novels which began to appear from the end of the 18th century onwards. So, just like it was happening in poetry, even in the form of the novel, there was a tendency towards romantic representations and romantic themes by the end of the 18th century, even in the form of the novel. So, in that sense, some of these novels could be identified as pre-romantic. The novels such as William Godwin's Caleb Williams with the subtitle Things as They Are, published in 1794. It was seen as a novel of propaganda with elements of crime detection, pursuit and punishment built into it. It was also considered as one of the earliest psychological novels, in the sense that there was a certain psychological portrait of a character available in this particular novel. Robert Bates' novel titled Hemsprong, it also had a subtitle which echoed Godwin, Man as He Is Not, and in 1792 he also had published another novel which again showed much inspiration from Godwin, Man as He Is. So, in this work Bates proposed his views on class and privilege, and he also spoke about the equality for women. He was extremely conventional of the kind of things which were happening in English society during that time. As we noticed when we spoke about the rise of the novel in the 18th century, there was also this dominant form of Gothic fiction which was also becoming immensely popular even in the 19th century. The most significant factor perhaps in the beginning of the 19th century was that there were more women in the literary scene. We begin to see that there were a number of writers such as Frances Burney, Clara Reeve, Elizabeth Archibald and Mary Robinson, who were dominating the literary scene even about 3 decades before Jane Austen started writing. So, this was immensely significant for us to later position the novel as a form predominated by the women writers. And also at this point of time, significantly enough, novels were mostly read by women, and in that sense it is also interesting to note that the novel form was more popular and had more women readership than even Mary Wollstonecraft's work such as Vindication of the Rights of Women, which even laid a foundation for the feminist writing and the feminist thinking. So, the point is that in the beginning of the 19th century, it was not unusual to find women writers, but at the same time they did have to struggle compared to the male writers to find a publisher, and even they had to continue exercising a lot of caution when it came to certain taboo subjects, or even while talking about particular kinds of gender treatment. And in that sense, we can also find plenty of mocking references to the tribe of the lady novelists who were emerging from the 19th century, and we find them getting consolidated more effectively later in the Victorian period. And it is also important to note that the circulating libraries, about which we have spoken a little earlier also, they also played a major role in ensuring that the books were getting available and the books were reaching the women even within the private spaces. So, when one begins to talk about the novel in the Romantic age, there are divergent opinions of it. Some historians are also of the opinion that there is no such thing as a romantic novel like romantic poetry. They are perhaps right, because we do not find a particular kind of novel form emerging just like romantic poetry. In a way, it was only a continuation of the age of sensibility which had begun to dominate the 18th century in the second half of the period. And what is more important perhaps in the 19th century when we talk about novel in the Romantic period is that the 19th century began to witness the evolution of novel into a wide-ranging genre. It was no longer considered as an inferior level with a low critical esteem. In fact, one of the characters in Jane Austen's novel Northanger Abbey, she talks about the novel being, oh, it is only a novel. So, that was the general tendency in the late 18th century, and even in the early 19th century the novel was considered as a much inferior form than all the other genres put together. But in the 19th century, as the century progressed, we noticed that the novel form becomes more significant, it becomes one of the most popular form of writing, and it is also highly regarded as a literary genre. So, with this understanding in mind, we want to look at one of the earliest writers of the 19th century, Maria Edgeworth. She was considered as a writer of small-scale provincial novels, mostly set in Ireland. The Act of the Union, which happened in 1801, had brought Ireland fully under the control of England, thereby forming the United Kingdom. The union was proper in the sense that it was both a political and a legal union. It's also useful to remember that in 1702, the Act of Union had brought Scotland under the English control. Maria Edgeworth wrote particularly about the Irish life, and her first work, Castle Wrekin, published in 1800, it was a regional novel and an evocation of history set before the year 1782. Because of her popularity and in her immense output in terms of literary work, she began to be known as the Great Maria, and she wrote several novels about the Irish society, which were later to become an inspiration for many others such as Scott to write about particular provinces and about particular communities. Her novel published in 1812, The Absentee, was also an immense success. It was followed by Ormond. She also had written immensely for children, and most of those children's books were hugely popular during her time. They continued to be published with newer editions at a later point of time as well. But however, we find her reputation getting eclipsed after the arrival of Jane Austen. Jane Austen was a major literary event that happened in the scene of novel in the early 19th century. The number of novels that she wrote and the kind of attention that she got, not just during her lifetime but even after her posterity. The number of novels that she wrote and the kind of attention that she received, not just during her lifetime but even in the posterity, it ensured that she is rated among the foremost women writers of the period. Jane Austen, however, lived only for 42 years. She lived from 1775 till 1817, and her major works include Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, Persuasion, Emma and Mansfield Park. She started writing at a very young age, even before she turned 12 years old. That's what most of the historians claim. But however, though she was writing in the 1790s, they were not written consciously for any kind of publication. So in that sense, we also find her revisiting these works and redrafting them at a later point in order to make them ready for publication. And she was someone who wrote in the midst of the various debates which were happening in England at that time about radicalism, about women's rights, about primitivism. And but nevertheless, we do not find any of these things finding their way into her novel canvas. Instead, she applied the techniques of the novel to the acute observation of society in microcosm. She was not concerned about the larger things that were happening. She was not concerned about the politics or the history or the economics of those times, but she tried to focus on whatever that she was more familiar with. In her own words, 3 or 4 families in a country village was a little bit of ivory on which I work, and she was indeed successful in doing that. And we find her deliberately avoiding effect, exaggeration and excess in her work, and this was also a revolutionary thing within the canvas of the novel. And her works were limited in scope, and we also find that her works were quite readable. The readers could directly observe and relate the worlds which she was recreating within her novels, and it did not prompt any of the readers to judge the characters. So in that sense, she also moves away from many of the dominant traits, and she brought the characters closer home to the readers. What made Jane Austen quite different from most of the other writers of those times was that she was writing during a time dominated by war. If you remember, the Napoleonic Wars were happening, and it was really troubling not just Britain but also the rest of Europe. But we do not find any of them finding their way to Austen's novel. This was also in terms of literature, it was the time of the historical novel and the Gothic novel, but Austen chooses not to write about war. In fact, she only touches upon one of those wars very slightly, the Battle of Trafalgar, in her work Persuasion. Most of her works are about novels and about reading. We find a lot of reference to all of these activities, and there's a sense of privacy, a sense of private life that we get in most of Austen's novels. For example, in the novel Northanger Abbey, there's a lot of discussion about writing, about novel reading, about the role of women in the context of the production and the reading of novels, etc. Talking about the literary career of Jane Austen, it's important to note that Sense and Sensibility was the first novel to be published in 1811. This novel got published only after a number of attempts. She failed at it initially, and she could get it published only at the age of 35. And it's also said that the first versions of these novels were probably written around 1795-97, and Northanger Abbey, though it was the first one to be completed around 1798, it was published only in 1818. This was in spite of Austen successfully selling the novel to a publisher in 1803 itself. This also is an indication about the kind of difficulties that women had to face even in the beginning of the 19th century to get their work published, because there still was a reluctance for the publishers to accept the work, because one was not too sure about the kind of fame and the kind of popularity that these works would achieve. Austen in many ways was a very different was a writer with a very different temperament, and in certain ways she also went against the dominant grain of the period. We find her gently satirizing the enthusiasm for the Gothic novel in some of her works, and this was very important because though her canvas was very little, and though she did not engage with wider aspects, we do find her exhibiting a lot of courage in defying certain literary conventions. Along with Northanger Abbey, Persuasion was also published posthumously in 1818, and she also died a very early death at the age of 42. In most of Austen's novels, we find Austen focusing mostly on young heroines who also became cult figures in the popular culture even at a later point of time, and some of her important heroine figures include Elena, Marianne, Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, Fanny Price of Mansfield Park, Emma from the novel with the same title, and Anne Elliot from the novel Persuasion. And we also find that interestingly the sister characters who appear in most of her novels, they are given contrasting characteristics, and also most of her novels are peppered with twists and turns of emotion in search of love, marriage, happiness and social status. In a way, there is a certain predictability as well associated with her plot structure and the turn of events, the climax, and many of the other minor details that follow. At the same time, most of the critics and the later historians had a lot of nice things to say about the way in which the Jane Austen could bring in things together with a lot of coherence. Pat Rogers remarks, a Jane Austen novel surprises the reader by the neatness with which commonplace topics are illuminated from different points of view. But however, despite all of these varieties that she brought into novel writing, Austen was not a very popular writer during her lifetime. In fact, only 2 of them reached a second edition in her lifetime. But however, we also notice that at a later point of time, her reputation rose steadily throughout the 19th century, and we do find her emerging as one of the most popular and the most widely read writer, not of her times, but also of the world history altogether. Instantly, one of the most important writers of those times, Walter Scott, he had reviewed Emma quite favorably during her lifetime itself. And some of the wise cracks from her novels, they also have become oft quoted. They have been used and reused in many other different contexts. And one such opening line is from the novel Pride and Prejudice, which reads like this: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a subtle." It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The subtle humor in this was quite inspiring and quite entertaining, not just in the 19th century, but it continues to be a source of entertainment even in today's popular imagination. Interestingly, most of Jane Austen's works were translated into the celluloid. Find that movies have been made and remade based on this work, and some of them are faithful adaptations and some of them have reworked on these various aspects of the novel, and we do find that she continues to interest the readers and audiences of the contemporary as well. And talking about her language, that also played a very important role in securing her position as one of the modern writers, because her language was of a recognizably modern English variety, and we can easily read her without using any reference or dictionaries or any special editions. The language was quite simple and lucid, and it was also closer to the modern variety of English. However, some of the words that were used during those times, especially in Jane Austen's novels, they have changed their meaning in due course. For example, injury used to mean upset or hurt, comprehended had the meaning included, intercourse meant only communication, lounging was walking or strolling, essay was an attempt. For example, one could say this is my first essay instead of this is my first attempt. Speak for meant order. In those days, especially in the novels of Jane Austen's, one could speak for tea instead of ordering for tea, and compliment flattery. Austen's works were not free from criticism. Even during her own lifetime, many of the other critics, mostly male, found her work very delicate and ironical, and they also thought that her femininity and her lack of ambition and hope was not very promising when it came to literature. And also there was this criticism that her novels were mostly about the gentry and addressed to the gentry. But one could always say that Austen perhaps had a deliberate reason for avoiding certain topics which were more pressing during those times, because she was living during a time which was threatened on all sides by war, class division, loneliness, uncertainty and failure. Perhaps it was a deliberate decision on Austen's part to avoid all of these confusions and to talk about certain very familiar things, which was also maybe part of her search for order in a world beset by chaos. As the historian Hudson puts it, Austen deliberately limited her area of concern. Her range was narrow, and as she never ventured beyond her own experience and powers, she achieved, as no other English novelist has achieved, an even level of perfection. But in spite of these wonderful comments that Hudson gives about Austen, it's also quite disappointing to note that Hudson devotes only a tiny section of his literary history to the discussion of Jane Austen's novel. It's barely a paragraph that he has devoted to the discussion of Jane Austen and all her novels. When we talk about the plots in Austen's novels, it's very important to notice that it was set in the future of marriage, and she deliberately does not succumb to an ethos of the past, but is endeavoring to confront the realities of a difficult future without taking recourse to the falsity of a comfortable, happy ending. And this is perhaps something that made her very different from the other novelists, and also made her quite enduring to the later periods as well. And as we move on to talk about the novels of Walter Scott, it's important to begin with a comparison and a contrast between these two dominating figures, Jane Austen and Walter Scott, who were also considered as the representatives of the novel form in the 19th century, who were also considered as the representatives of the novel form in the Romantic period. Where Jane Austen deliberately limited her area of concern, Walter Scott opened up the novel to the full panorama of revolution, dissent, rebellion and social change. The settings of his novels are in the past rather than the immediate and highly troubled present. This is how the Routledge History of English Literature introduces Walter Scott's novels. In a way, here we are also highlighting the fact that just like the Romantic poets were highly individual and had very different traits, and also even had almost contrasting traits, in the same way we find that the two leading novelists of the Romantic period also were highly individualistic and displayed extremely contrasting traits from one another. It's also useful to recall that Walter Scott had begun his literary career as a poet, and later he shifts to the novel writing. And this was seen as a bit threatening perhaps by Austen herself, and from a private letter written by Jane Austen to one of her nieces, we find this complaint: Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It's not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like him and do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but fear I must. So with this interesting detail, we move on to look at the novelistic career of Sir Walter Scott. As we have taken a look at an earlier point itself, Scott had begun his literary career by writing romance in verse, and he later, we find, turns to the writing of prose fiction. But however, many literary critics are of the opinion that even in the beginning of his career, though even when he was producing successful verse narratives one after the other, he was perhaps unconsciously gravitating towards a novel form. In some of his later narrative poems, we do find a tendency which is more fictional and which is more prose oriented. For example, one of his earliest poems, The Lay of the Last Minstrel, it's written in the form of an old ballad. However, when we come to some of his later narrative poems, such as The Roquebuy, it is considered as a novel in verse. And many historians and critics are also of the opinion that the verse in The Roquebuy is almost like a hindrance to his power. Had this been in prose, they feel that it would have very well become like a novel. And interesting also to remember that Scott's original ambitious desire was to write a novel like The Castle of Otranto, by Horace Walpole, which also had laid the foundations of the Gothic fiction in the 18th century. But however, the moment Walter Scott realized that he was reaping immense success in verse romances and also the kind of success that continued to run into several years, he decided to stick to writing verse romances. And there is also this opinion about Walter Scott's shift from writing verse romances to prose fiction, that he was feeling a little threatened by the sudden rise of Byron, and that he suddenly decided that since his supremacy cannot be maintained any longer, it's wiser and better to turn to another genre. And another fresh stimulus was the Irish tales of Maria Edgeworth, which was becoming hugely popular in England. This also had struck a particularly different chord on Walter Scott, because he was quite intrigued by the way in which Maria Edgeworth was portraying the life of Irish people in greater detail. So, this is what he had in mind then. What Miss Edgeworth had done for Ireland, he might do for Scotland. So, his novelistic aspirations in some form springs from this desire to talk about the life within Scotland. So, his first work, Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years, the first draft of it said that it was accomplished in 3 weeks, though he had begun thinking about it from the 1790s onwards. That's what most of the historians feel. This work was published in 1814 anonymously, and this was also a time when Britain was at the fag end of the Napoleonic Wars and also was getting triumphant in that. However, this first work itself proved immensely successful, that he continued to write a number of novels which also began to be collectively known as the Waverley Novels. When we analyze Scott's success as a novelist, it's important to note right at the outset that he was one person in whom we could find two different lines of influence. On the one hand, there was a heavy influence and a steady influence of the Romanticism, which made him reap a lot of success as a romantic poet as well. And on the other hand, when it came to his novelistic writing and also the translation of his personal experiences into a novel form, he was someone who had direct contact and intimate knowledge of every aspect of Scottish life. So, this had influenced him immensely in writing these set of novels, and we also find him doing a wonderful job about it. And so much so that his first attempt, Waverley, in that he successfully could blend the interest of romance and realism within a historical framework. And this was also one of the first kind of novels to do this. And he was also considered as a poet of the peasant, soldier, outlaw and artisan. So, when it came to writing the novels, he continued to enjoy the same kind of popularity. The set of novels which are now known as the Waverley Novels were a range of novels written from 1814 titled Waverley till 1819, the last one being The Bride of Lammermoor. This had run into about 27 volumes. They continue to be of much historical and literary interest. He was knighted in 1820 and was offered the post of the poet laureate as well, but he refused to accept it, and we all know that it went to Sadeh in 1814. Interestingly, Scott published all of his novels anonymously until 1827. This is perhaps an indication of the low consideration the novel form still had until Scott began to notice his own worldwide success. In fact, he is considered by Pat Rogers as the first hugely popular international best-selling author, and he also reached a vast number of readers in many languages. It's said that he also became rich through his pen, but however, there was a brief time when he went through a major economic crisis in 1826 when the economic depression struck England. The Scott's publisher, with whom he also had collaborated in various financial ventures, his entire business collapsed, and we find Scott also running into bankruptcy. But however, he decided to go on writing to pay off the debts incurred, and he was quite successful in doing that as well. In the 20th century, there was a steady decline of Scott's reputation. We also find Scott being heavily overshadowed by the Victorian writers that followed. But however, during his lifetime, he was the best known figure from the Romantic period. He was also the best known English writer who enjoyed a reputation not just in England but across Europe, and also in some of the colonies in which the England and other European countries ruled over. If we try to trace Scott's engagement with history in his works, it would be interesting to notice the kind of range and the versatility that Scott possessed as a novelist. In the novel Waverley, he talks about the Jacobite rebellion of 1745, and he was also quite well versed with the 12th century crusades, which he discusses in The Talisman. In Ivanhoe, he discusses the clash between Saxons and Normans. In Abbott, on the other hand, it is about Mary, the Queen of Scots. In his novel The Heart of Midlothian, he talks about the portier's riots that happened in Edinburgh. In Rob Roy, the characters such as Robin Hood and King Richard Lionheart play a major role in taking the plot forward. And overall, it is possible to say that not just through his historical intervention and also through the various forms of treatment and the newer kinds of subject matter that he brought into the discussion of the novel, he transformed the very nature, the scope and future of the novel. It was no longer considered as an inferior genre after the success that Scott enjoyed. It was also seen as a genre which ensured much returns in terms of economic independence as well. Some of the other important novels of Walter Scott include Guy Mannering, The Antiquary, Old Mortality, Robbie Roy, The Heart of Midlothian and The Bride of Lammermoor. And these set of novels were also early novels, mostly historical and set in Scotland. Ivanhoe was set in England in the 12th century. In fact, even when he published Ivanhoe, it was published anonymously. The only note in the title page was that it was by the author of Waverley. We find the same thing happening in his work Kenilworth, set in 1575 England, that it was by the author of Waverley and Ivanhoe. So, Scott's claim to fame was mostly as the author of Waverley and later as the author of Waverley and Ivanhoe. We do not find his name being printed in most of the early editions of these novels. In 1832, one of his final works was published, Quentin Durward, where he engaged with France in the 15th century. In addition to the two towering figures of Jane Austen and Sir Walter Scott, there were also a few other writers who were associated with the romantic novel, and Mary Shelley was also one among the foremost of these writers. She already had an intellectual tradition to claim, her being the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft and also married to Percy Bysshe Shelley. Her novel, published in 1818, titled Frankenstein, was a Gothic horror story in the 18th century tradition, and this was the tradition, if you remember, established by Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe. And this work, Frankenstein, was written by Mary Shelley at a very young age of 19, and this is now classified as the scientific Gothic. Frankenstein, as we know, it also became an important text from the 19th century. It also continued to capture the literary as well as the cinematic imagination of the 19th and 20th centuries. This is also considered as one of the most popular and one of the most widely read works, which is now also classified as one of the science fiction works. In Frankenstein, she dealt with the creation of a living creature from the bones of the dead. The horror in it was the kind which was hitherto unknown, and she also could bring in elements of science and bring in elements of the Gothic quite successfully into it. In 1826, she published The Last Man, which was also considered as a futuristic novel. There were other important novelists of this period who also deserve a particular mention. Charles Robert Maturin was the author of Melmoth the Wanderer. Theodore Hook was a writer who was quite popular during his time, but he failed to really make it in terms of literary reputation to the later period. John Galt's Ayrshire Legacies and Annals of the Parish engaged with the contemporary Scottish life. We also find him imitating Walter Scott in certain aspects. Thomas Love Peacock was a very good friend of Shelley. He could write wittily and satirically about many things, of which he also gave a commentary. And we also find him going against most of the literary conventions of those times, particularly in his works such as Headlong Hall, Melincourt, Nightmare Abbey and Crochet Castle. We find him giving a lot of opinion, that to unconventional opinion about many of the dominant tendencies of the literature of those times. These works were also known as opinion novels. George Payne, Rainsford James and William Harrison Ainsworth were followers of Scott, though their work had a lot of humour built into it and also were immensely popular and readable during those times. Due to their flawed literary merit, many of the historians and critics have not included them in the canon at a later point. There was also a set of works known as the Oriental Tales, The understanding of the Orient in 19th century ranged from the Middle East to India, and it would be enough to state that the empire and colonialism contributed greatly to the storehouse of images for the use of the Romantic writers. Some of the works which could be classified as Oriental tales deserve a special mention. For example, Scott's The Talisman, it had a Palestinian connection. James Morier wrote The Adventures of Haji Baba and published it in 1824. Caroline Lamb's Ada Race in 1823 and William Beckford's Vathek was published in 1786. So, from the end of the 18th century onwards, we find the Orient and its images fascinating the English reading public, and this fascination, as we know, it continued till the beginning of the 20th century. As and when we begin to wrap up our discussion of the Romantic age and also the novelistic productions of this period, it is important to note that whatever confusion and whatever dilemmas that the Romantic writers were facing, it was not really settled even at the end of the Romantic period. An observation made by Thomas Love Peacock in his work The Crochet Castle, published in 1831, would be quite appropriate as and when we begin to wind up this session. He wrote, "The sentimental against the rational, the intuitive against the inductive, the ornamental against the useful, the intense against the tranquil, the romantic against the classical. These are great and interesting controversies which I should like, before I die, to see satisfactorily settled." It would perhaps just suffice to say that none of the Romantic writers saw any of these controversies getting successfully settled, and we also find them being yet another foundation to the emergence of Victorian literature, which we shall begin to look at in the following sessions. So, with this, we wind up our discussion on the Romantic age and also this particular lecture. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.